How do you discover a passion? Children, when they're playing, are exploring what they want to do, and they play in ways that they enjoy, and they become good at that kind of play. Many of them go on to careers that they love because they've been playing and discovering what they love, and they've gotten good at it, and now they can find a way to make a living doing basically what they were doing as kids.
Hi, and welcome to the KindlED podcast, where we dig into the art and science behind kindling the motivation, curiosity, and mental well-being of the young humans in our lives.
Together, we'll discover practical tools and strategies you can use to help kids unlock their full potential and become the strongest version of their future selves.
Welcome to the KindlED podcast. We're super excited about today's episode. Hi, Adriane. How are you?
I am very good. How are you, Kaity?
Your name's a little easier to elongate. Everything's good. We're feeling good at the Broadbent house. Super excited about this episode. Like very personally excited because we're talking to Peter Gray, the author of Free to Learn, which was really one of the first books that got me excited about a different way of raising kids and treating kids and thinking about kids and educating kids, all of it. So will you tell us a little bit more about Peter Gray?
Absolutely. And I'm super excited as well. I've read his book and then also have read just a lot of his work over the years. I feel like his name pops up a lot in the work that we do.
Yeah, definitely a pioneer in all of this for sure.
So Peter Gray is a research professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College who has conducted and published research in behavioral biology, developmental psychology, anthropology, and education. His recent research focuses on the role of play in human evolution and how children educate themselves through play and exploration when they are free to do so. He has expanded on these ideas in his book, which Kaity and I highly recommend, Free to Learn: Why Unleashing the Instinct to Play Will Make Our Children Happier, More Self-Reliant, and Better Students for Life. Okay, let's talk to Peter.
Let's do it. Peter Gray, welcome to the KindlED podcast. We're super excited to have you.
Very happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's jump into our conversation today. Our first question, we kind of ask this in all of our podcasts just because I think it's so interesting to get people's background, because we all come to this work of helping inspire a love of learning in kids from all different walks of life. So what originally inspired you to get into education and to start influencing the world in the way that you have? What's kind of your mission or your big why?
Well, I got started in this many years ago when my own son was struggling in school. Struggling might not be quite the right word for it. He was rebelling in school. He was he was making a nuisance of himself in school. I'd say the teachers were struggling with him. He was going to a regular suburban school that seemed to have a good reputation, just typical suburban school. And he hated it. From kindergarten on through fourth grade, he fought it every step of the way. He would come home every day saying, it's a prison. They don't treat me like a human being. They're telling me to do stupid things that don't make any sense. They say they have an open door policy, but when I go out the door, they tell me I'm not allowed to do that. And of course, his mother and I were being called in regularly for conferences. What are we going to do with this kid? I tried. I honestly tried. I think they blamed us. Somehow they thought we were too loose on him or something like that. Maybe we were treating him respectfully, and so he was used to that. So that would be maybe my interpretation. But at any rate, at that time, this was a long time ago, and homeschooling was not a big thing then. And I don't think homeschooling would have been, for various reasons, a good approach for us anyway. So we kept trying. I remember I'd have these long conversations with him. I'd say, just do what they're telling you to do. It'd be so much easier than fighting it, and so much easier for your mom and me too, right? Just do it. It's not that hard. But he would for some reason, he was just constitutionally built in such a way, and he's still this kind of person that if something seems stupid to him, he won't do it. And so it was a constant struggle, and it finally reached the point where there was a confrontation in the principal's office where supposedly we adults were going to present a united front to him that he absolutely had to follow the rules of school. He had to do what he was told to do in school. So this was near the end of fourth grade, if I'm remembering correctly. And so in the principal's office, there was the principal, the assistant principal, the teacher, an assistant teacher, the school psychologist, and some other psychologist who was brought in for this special occasion, his mother and me. And we were all there, and what we were to do was to each present in no uncertain terms in the united force that he had to follow the rules of school. So we each presented our piece, honestly presented it as strongly as we could. And he looked at us and he said, "Go to hell." So, so it's funny
Okay.
now, right?
Cool. Yeah, was it funny back then?
So his mother and I looked at each other, and we could see we both had tears in our eyes at that moment. And the tears were not our tears were the recognition that he was right, that we were not listening to him, that we had to listen to him. We could see that in each other's face. We had to be on his side, not against him. And we decided really right there, but discussing it afterwards, we're going to take him out of the school. It was almost the end of the term, so he finished out the term, but we knew he would not go back there for fifth grade. But we didn't know what we were going to do. And, I was not in developmental psychology. I was doing brain research on rats and mice and binding of certain hormones, laboratory work, real science right back then. So I was doing that kind of stuff. And, but I was aware of different approaches to education. I actually had a younger brother, much younger brother, 12 years younger than me, who quit school. I don't even remember exactly when, but something like when he was 11 or 12, and went on to a very good life without continuing with school. So I was aware that you can do this. And he had gone for a little while to an alternative school in Vermont. And so I had some awareness of that. And I had read Summerhill, the book by A.S. Neal, which is kind of the pioneering, the kind of the gospel in those days of children's freedom and so on. So I did not come to this totally ignorant about alternatives. We both knew of this school called the Sudbury Valley School. It was both my wife and I, and I think at one point we had even considered it, but we're hesitant to do it because it was so radically different from a typical school. But in the end, what happened is we decided we'd enroll him there. And so we visited various other schools, some private schools that we never could have afforded anyway. But fortunately, he hated them as much as the other schools. So we visited Sudbury Valley and we spent some time visiting. This was the alternative school really designed for self-directed education. He said, if what I'm seeing here is true, if this isn't a show, this is what school should be. He was clear on that. And the school was only 2 miles away from us. So at that time, that was regarded as easy walking distance for a 10-year-old. He'd be 10 when he started. Now, people would be reluctant to have a 10-year-old walk that far, but in those days, this was common. So he rolled there, and the happiness returned to him. The anger disappeared. The brightness in his eyes, the kid that I had known before he started school reemerged. And he was clearly doing very well and very happy. But I was still concerned, and not concerned specifically about his own education in any real sense, but I was concerned, well, what if he decides at some point that he wants to do something that requires going to college. I was a college professor. That doesn't mean that I think that I'd pushed my own kid into college. I don't think it's all that important, but nevertheless, what if if he wanted to be a doctor or a scientist or something? They almost have to go to college these days to do these kinds of things. So, here's a school that doesn't have any courses, that doesn't give any grades, that doesn't evaluate the students in any way, and where they're basically playing and exploring and following their own interests. They're not learning the curriculum that school thinks is so important. How could he ever go to college if he ever wants to go to college, if he decides to stay there on through what would be called high school someplace else? There they don't separate grades in any way. So I began to ask about the graduates, and I'd be told these stories about so and so who's doing really, very well. But being a scientist, I wanted more objective data. I didn't want to just rely on a few anecdotes of so and so doing really well. So I thought it would be nice to have, as the school had already been around at that time long enough that there were graduates of the school who had done all of what would be their K through 12 education there, as well as many who had done at least what would be their secondary education at that school. And so I wanted to do a systematic study of the graduates. And at first I tried to get people in education interested in doing such a study. There were people over at Harvard, just across the river from me, who claimed to be interested in democratic education. I said, well, here's a perfect opportunity for you. And they were not interested. And so finally I decided if this study is going to be done, I guess I'm going to have to do it. So I collaborated with a person who was a part-time staff member at the school at that time, who was very valuable in helping track down the graduates. We tracked down almost all of them at that time. There were something like 60 or something like 70 or 80 of them, actually. And we got, in the end, long responses from about 80% of all of the graduates. It was a very high rate of response, who filled out a long questionnaire in which we asked them about what they did at the school, their recollections of the school, how long they'd been at the school, and various questions about their life after the school. How did they go on to higher education of one sort or another? What sort? If they went on, how did they get in? How did they do in their own judgment? If they didn't go on, why didn't they go on? All of those kinds of questions. What career were they in? Or if they weren't in a career yet, what career were they oriented towards? And the results of that survey uh, was revolutionary to my thinking. It was absolutely amazing to me. So here was a group, a rather large group of young adults who had not done school as we think of school. And everybody thinks school is so important for success in adulthood. And here they are, successful in adulthood. One of my initial concerns was, well, maybe in a school for self-directed education, everybody becomes an artist or a musician living in their parents' basement because they can't make a living. And I did not want my son living in my basement. I love my son, but I didn't want him living in my basement.
Fair enough.
It was important to me to find out that people went into other careers. They didn't all become artists. There was a disproportionate number of artists and musicians, I must say, but remarkable number who were actually successful, making a good living doing it because they had gotten good at it and they'd really developed their passions at it. But there were people in really every walk of life that we value. There were people in human services. There were people who were business people, not so much business executives. They were more likely to found their own business if they were going into business. I could not see any general realm of employment that we value that there was not somebody in. The only realms which wouldn't be surprising that you didn't find people in is the most boring kind of routine work. So people were not working on assembly lines. At that time, there was still such a thing as assembly line factories. And people were not in middle management where you're kind of shuffling papers and so on. So if they were in business, they were starting their own business. But there were scientists. There was the person who eventually became a professor of mathematics who had been there all his entire education, except for maybe first or second grade. So this really impressed me. And now I was intrigued even more from my academic perspective. I gradually stopped doing the laboratory work and began doing, at first, observational research at the school. So here they are. By any reasonable definition of education, they're educated. I mean, if you define education, and the way I define education these days certainly is, it's everything that you learn that helps you live a satisfying, meaningful, and moral life. And these people were living satisfying, meaningful, and moral lives. So, by that definition of education, which is the only really meaningful definition that I can come up with, they were well educated. As far as I could see, there was nothing special about their personalities. They came from all kinds of backgrounds. This is not an expensive school. This is not people who would normally be going to a private school. These are people who would otherwise be going to a public school. Most of them, not all of them, had been to a public school, as my son had been before they came. But there were some who came just because their parents believed in the thing right from the beginning. There were some who came because they sent their kid who was trouble in school there, but once you've sent one kid there, it's hard to then send your other kid to public school. So the younger siblings came just because, the family had decided this is where our kids are going to go to school. So and I could not see. We also interviewed a fair number of those who were still living there. I could not see any particular personality characteristics. Like, some people will say, well, maybe this would work for a certain type of person, and I just couldn't see any relationship to the type of person. We also looked at the reason. We also asked some questions about the reasons for coming to the school, and some people came because their parents believed in it from the beginning, but some people came because for one reason or another, public school wasn't working for them. And those reasons varied. Like, for my son, it wasn't working because he was rebellious. But for some, it wasn't working because some of them had a diagnosis of ADHD or something like that. And the parents didn't want to give them Ritalin at that time, or the whatever the drugs were at that time that you gave. And so they took the kid out of school rather than follow that drug routine. There were some who had literally failed their classes, and the parents didn't know what to do. They sent them to this school. So this is not necessarily a group that it certainly wasn't a group that the public school system would say this is the cream of the crop. These are kids who are coming from a variety of reasons. There were some, I have to brag and say my kid was very bright, but not everybody were kids who you'd automatically talk to them and think, this is somebody very bright. This is a precocious kid. There are a whole range of kids.
Well, a lot of very bright kids are very oppositional because they think deeper about things than just going, oh, okay, I'm going to do what I'm told.
I think that's right. I mean, history is full. If you do a study of sort of famous inventors, most of them dropped out of school. But not all of them were in that category. They're and yet they're doing very well in the world. They're finding their way. They're doing. Interestingly, when we asked them about college, why did you go to college or not go to college, there did not seem to be. We normally have the feeling like the academically bright kids are obviously going to go to college, and the kids who are not so academically oriented would be the ones not going to college, the ones for whom that would be more difficult work. It didn't seem to be the case for Sudbury Valley graduates. It seemed to be the case. It really depended on, did you have a good reason for going to college? Did you have a need to go to college? Either because you're going on to a career that requires college, or because for one reason or another, you honestly want uh, 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 an education that's given to you. And some of them said that, after all this self directed education, it would be kind of fun to go to a place where people just tell me the stuff and what to do. And boy, that would be fun. So there were some who were actually in that category, believe it. They'd not been burned out about school. It was a refreshing idea to go to a liberal arts education. There were a few in that category, but more often it was because they were interested in something that required college. Oftentimes, the ones that seemed the most intellectually oriented, but they weren't oriented towards a career that required college, said, I didn't go to college because I didn't feel any need for college. I certainly don't need college to learn. Nobody needs college to learn. The only reason you'd go to college is for that diploma. So, and I think everybody understands that now, but they don't admit it. But but they recognized that back then. That was before the internet. It's more obvious now that you don't need to go to college to learn than it was then. But to them, it was obvious even then because they'd been learning whatever they wanted to know uh, in a situation where they found out how to find it out, how to learn it. So that was so these were and when I asked them questions about, well, I asked them, what do you think is the benefit, and what if there are any harms to having done this unusual education? What would that be? And everybody came up with benefits. Only a few came up with harm. And the biggest harm they came up with is, I'm really tired of explaining to people where I went to school. And the other thing they said was that when they started, if they went on to college, when they started college, they were worried. They felt like everybody else is going to know so much more than me. And they felt a little bit behind in some classes at the beginning, but they all said they quickly caught up, that it turned out not to be an issue. In terms of what was the advantage, there was a lot of uniformity in what they said was the advantage, but the primary things they said was that they knew how to take control of their own life, that they felt that they could make their own. They knew how to make decisions. They knew how to take responsibility for themselves. One of the biggest complaints about those who went to college was how immature the students were. Why would you be going to this place and be drinking and missing classes? Why would the first question after a lecture be, what are we responsible for on the test, rather than a question about the material? So that's that was the kind of complaint they had, and I was very sympathetic with that as a college professor. Very tired of that question: what are we responsible for on the test?
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that background. That really helps us understand your why and the work that you devoted a lot of your life to. And it's amazing that it started with that one phrase of "go to hell." But your research really emphasizes the importance of play. So could you define what play is and then elaborate a little more on how play contributes to their cognitive and their social development?
Right. So you're right that that study that I did is what led me to an interest in play. That first study, because when you visit the school and you see what kids are doing, they're not. Once you're free, they're not sitting there studying algebra textbooks. They're not. They're playing. They're playing. They're exploring. They're sitting around talking to one another. Nowadays, they're on the computer a lot, playing video games as well as other things. They're playing outdoors. They're engaged in arguments of various sorts. They're doing exactly what you would think kids would be doing when they're free to do what they want to do. You might find a few kids, especially some of the older kids, who are preparing, maybe with a little bit of help, for the SAT test if they're planning to go out to a college that requires that. So you might see that. You might see a few kids who have decided they're interested in history and they've organized a little history class and gotten a staff member to teach it. But for the most part, the kids are playing and exploring and following their own interests. And if you're looking at it from the viewpoint of, if the only thing you know that this is a school, you would assume that all the grades are on recess at the same time right now that we are there, because that's what it looks like. So so that got me then interested in play, and I began reading about play. I began along with one of my graduate students, one of the students who was for his PhD dissertation, spent spent really hundreds of hours at the school observing, especially age mixed play among children who vary in age. The founder of the school, Danny Greenberg, had always argued that a school like this wouldn't work if the children were segregated by age. The reason it works, he says, is because the children are playing and exploring and talking with children over the whole age range. So younger children are getting interested in reading because they see older children reading, and they want to do that. Just like they see older children climbing trees and they want to climb trees. They engage in games with older children, and that way get drawn into higher levels of activity, games that might involve reading. And so they learn to read in the context of the games. Even more true now with video games. So they are playing games that involve calculating averages or calculating, certainly adding up scores. They're involved in the kitchen, maybe with older kids, cooking, and you have to know what half a cup means. So you're learning some arithmetic just in the course of everyday life there. If you had everybody the same age and everybody equally ignorant about everything, then the play doesn't boost you up any higher. The fact that they're playing across ages makes all the difference. And so we wrote an article about my graduate student and I wrote an article about the value of age mixed play. But we also, when you observe play and you really observe it, and I often recommend to parents, just sometime, just watch your kids play in a way that they're not aware that you're watching, that you're present. And that's kind of what I was doing at the school. I was trying to be a fly on the wall, and my graduate student even more so. Just observing. I'd pretend to read a magazine, but I'd be paying attention to what they're doing. And when you pay attention to what you're doing, you're amazed at how sophisticated the children are when they're playing. How sophisticated, even little children playing a game of superheroes or something. They're negotiating. They're talking about. They're working out differences about who's going to be the superhero and who's going to be the one rescued. Who has to be the pet dog? Who has to? There's all this negotiation going on among 4 and 5 year olds, right? And when you watch older kids playing and how they figure out the teams and make them fair and work out the rules, and especially in an age mix situation, work out ways to make it fun for everybody, for the little kids as well as the big kids, you are amazed at how sophisticated children are in the context of play. And so that played a huge role. Now, so ultimately, I began to really think about play, and I began to wonder, why is there so relatively little research in play? Play seems to be a huge part of human nature, and yet psychologists almost never talk about play. They're beginning to a little bit now, but back then you could read whole developmental psychology books and there'd be almost nothing on play, believe it or not. And that's still kind of true. So when I talk to people, well, why is there so little study of play? One of the answers was, well, nobody can define play. It's such a vague concept. And so I thought, well, isn't that true for almost everything the psychologists study? Can you define love? Can you define,
How do you define play though? Because I've heard how you define play, and I think it's really spot on.
So all of this led me to think, all right, well, we need a definition of play. And it isn't the case that nobody had ever defined it. So I looked into there are some classic writings on play. And so I looked in how did those people define play? And then I brought that together with my own thoughts about play, and even together with a little bit of research that had been done about what kindergarten think. kids think of as play, what they decide is play. If you show them various activities, you ask them, is this play or not? And so I ended up with this definition of play, that play is an activity that involves the following 4 characteristics. The first characteristic, and maybe the most important one, is that it's self-chosen and self-directed. It's something that the players themselves decide to do, and it's something that the players themselves are in charge of. If a teacher stands up in front of the room and says, now children, we're all going to play this, it's automatically not play because that's initiated by the teacher.
Can teachers still play with the kids? Or like, I'm thinking about just the other day, my son was being defiant, or my husband told him not to throw a ball in the house, and he took the ball and threw it right at him. And then I like grabbed it, and then I just started diving deep into play. I'm like, oh, the ball's getting me, and so I didn't tell him what to do. And then all of a sudden he just ran with it. Then all of a sudden our kitchen became a basement, which we don't have a basement. We live in Arizona. And he was going down into the basement and coming out, and he was becoming a monster. And so I was just kind of going along with him. But can adults, is your definition involve adults at all?
It is possible for adults to play with children, but if the adult is in charge of the activity, and it's even possible for an adult to initiate an activity and it's still play, but a little league game of baseball is not play, because it's a formal activity. The rules are chosen by the adult. The activities are even micromanaged by the adult. One of the primary lessons of play that children learn in play is how to initiate their own activities. So what you did is fine, but you wouldn't want that to be the only way your child played. You would want play.
Right.
You would want your child to be with other children. You would want your child to have lots of opportunity to initiate play in a situation where there's not somebody who they might regard as an authority figure who's initiating it.
What about self-play? Like watching my 6-year-old just play, like just taking characters and building things and just going into his own world, talking to himself, but there's not another child there.
Yeah, that's very valuable play. I think that in most cultures, you would find much less of that and much more social play. We live in a culture where we're isolated from one another, and children are isolated from another. We have smaller families than we used to. We don't have extended families living next to us. We don't have neighborhoods. We don't send our kids outdoors where they're automatically playing. So our kids engage in more solo play than they otherwise would. That doesn't mean that there aren't times when any child would want to play solo. There's certain kinds of things that you want to do. You don't want to be interrupted by other kids. You want to do it your own way. These are more like artistic kinds of play, more like adventure, where you just really are creating your own creation, and you don't want to compromise it by working it out with some other kid. I think that's very valuable, but I don't think that's the most valuable kind of play. The most valuable kind of play is with other kids, because so I say that play is self-chosen and self-directed, but when you're playing with other kids, you've got to do this together with other kids. You've got to say, so you've got to negotiate. You've got to find something that both of you want to play, or all of you want to play if there's more than 2 of you. I argue that the most important thing children have to learn is how to get along with peers. That this is the key to success, is knowing how to get along with other people. You can live a happy life without knowing how to read. You can live a happy life without knowing where the heck Ukraine is. You cannot live a happy life if you don't know how to get along with other people. You cannot have a good marriage. You cannot have real friends. You cannot have good work partners. By far, the key to success is knowing how to get along with other people. And that's the primary lesson of social play, because when you're playing socially with no adult there to solve the problems, you've got to solve the problems. You've got to negotiate. You've got to figure out. Mother Nature has given you this strong drive to play with other kids. And so that's the motivation for learning how to get along with other kids. So I often write that the primary freedom in play is freedom to quit. And that's also the source of learning in play. So if you and I are kids and we're playing together and I'm not listening to you, I just want to do it my way. And I'm insisting you have to be the pet dog. And you say, I'm just really tired of being the pet dog. But I say, but I'm insisting you're the pet dog in this game that we're playing. You, as a self respecting child, will say, I hear my mom calling, I'm going home now. This is very common. This is what happened all the time in the days when kids were outdoor playing with one another. All the time, you would just leave if it wasn't happy for you. So that is the natural consequence of not listening to the other person. You want to play with them, but they're not going to play with you if you don't listen to them, if you don't compromise. So the primary lesson in social play is how to keep your playmates happy. And that, I would say, that is the most valuable skill in all of human life, how to keep your playmates happy, which then become your workmates, your romantic mate, your your life mate, and everything else. And if you can't tell when your playmate is happy or not, then you're doomed to failure in life. So that's why I say this is the most important kind of play, is social play with peers, with no adults around to intervene and be tattled to be there to solve the kids' problems. It's learning how to solve those problems yourself that's so important.
Real quick, I just want to kind of reflect on what I'm hearing you say. Earlier on in our conversation, we talked about kind of the passivity that we see in kids who have not experienced self-directed learning. They feel very like they have to wait until something. And we see the roots of this in play. If everything is always, the Little League example, if everything is always adult directed, they're just always in the seat of passivity and never in the seat of action. Right. And so that's one thing I'm hearing. And then the other thing I loved that you said was the right to quit. And this is something that does not exist in the world of education. They sit down and they must and they will. And if they say no, they are going to get an F. They're going to detention. There's all these things. And we don't really fully admit to ourselves that they do have the right to quit learning. And it's like the ramifications of that are too scary for adults to even contemplate. So then we come up with all of these reasons and these consequences and these bribes, which really makes kids rebel. There's something in each of us that really wants to control and to act. And we have that right as individuals, right? So that right is really stripped from kids in school. And something we like to say a lot on the Kindle podcast is that kids have to have a no to have a yes, right? You have to allow them this right to quit. I love how you stated that. So thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then real quick, Peter, too, what about, because we're talking about how play is really beneficial to get along with your peers, but what about the regulation of emotions? Or you've talked about play in mammals and how they help regulate the emotion of fear, which I found very fascinating.
So let me run through the other part of the defining characteristics of play. So I've talked about the first one, and then I'll say something about how play helps you regulate emotions. So the second characteristic of play is that it's intrinsically motivated. It's something that you're doing for its own sake. You're not doing it for some reward outside of itself. You're not doing it for a grade on a report card or a gold star or a trophy or praise from your parents or to lose weight. You're doing it just because you want to do it. So that is, in a sense, what leads many adults to think play is trivial. Why would you be doing something you're not getting something for? We're used to this idea that you should always be working for some prize. You should be working. But, when you hear graduation speakers talk about following your passions, how do you discover a passion? A passion is doing what you want to do. You have to discover what you want to do. So children, when they're playing, they are exploring what they want to do, and they play in ways that they enjoy, and they become good at that kind of play. One of my findings in my studies, not just that original study at Sudbury Valley, but some of my other studies of people who were learning through self-directed education, is that many of them go on to careers that they love. And the reason they do is because they've been playing and discovering what they love, and they've gotten good at it, And now they can find a way to make a living doing basically what they were doing as kids, and they are following their passions. They've developed a passion. So the idea that play is something, and kids play in different ways. Some kids are really passionate about sort of artistic play. Some kids are passionate about more athletic play. Some kids are passionate about intellectual play. Some kids are passionate about building things. And what I found is they go on to careers that are consistent with what they really love to do and became good at. So that's the second characteristic. Now, also think about this in terms of psychological well-being. Play is what makes you happy. Take away play, and what's going to happen? You're not going to be so happy. You're going to be depressed. There's one of the famous play researchers, Brian Sutton Smith, who died a few years ago, used to say in his talks, the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. And I think that, although the grammar doesn't work for me, I think that the truth is that a big reason so many young people are depressed is not the only reason, but a big reason is you take away play, and they're going to be depressed. The play is what counteracts depression. Play is what makes you happy. I might even add that it's not just play, but also other independent things, doing things on your own, doing things, feeling proud. I did this. I did it by myself. I'm growing up. I'm becoming, I'm taking control of my own life. These make people feel good, whether it's in the full definition of play or it's some other activity that they're, like paper routes that I had at 10 and most kids had by 10 or 11 when I was, or babysitting and things that kids don't do anymore. These are grown-up activities. You feel good. We're not allowing kids to do these things anymore. So this is taking away from them the very sorts of activities that make them happy. And then we wonder why they're so depressed. And then on top of that, we give them all these anxiety-provoking tests in school, and we wonder why they're so anxious. So that's the second characteristic of play. The third characteristic of play, which seems a little counterintuitive to some people, is that all play has rules. It doesn't necessarily have formal rules, and the rules are very changeable. But all play has rules in the sense, at least, of structural guidelines. People talk about unstructured play. I say there's no such thing as unstructured play. Play is never random. It's always structured. So when you're playing, you are doing something and you have in mind what you're doing, and it's bounded in certain ways by rules that are controlling what you're doing. I'm building a sandcastle. I'm not just randomly piling up sand. This is a structured activity. I'm building I've got a vision in my mind what that sandcastle is. And if there's two kids doing it, they're talking about that vision. They're creating the sandcastle shared in a way. You're playing superheroes. I have to act like Wonder Woman. I can't just act like a little girl. I have to act like Wonder Woman. The interesting thing about play is that you are voluntarily putting yourself in a situation where you're not free. You are freely putting yourself in a situation that is bound by rules. You can do that because you can always quit. Again, the value of quitting. I'm happy to do this because I know if it really becomes burdensome, if it really is no longer any fun, I can just quit. So you're putting yourself into a rule-bound situation. You're learning how to control your impulses. You might feel like, I fell down and I want to cry because I skinned my knee, but no, Wonder Woman wouldn't cry. So I'm going to control myself here. I'm not going to do that. And so children are learning. I think one of the reasons we have such high rates of impulsivity among children, I think it's partly that we're overdiagnosing that, calling it ADHD. But I think one of the reasons is that kids are not playing as much as they did in the past, don't have the opportunities to play, and they're not learning to control themselves in the way that they would be learning if they were playing, where you have to control. Your playmates will remind you if you're playing with other kids. Hey, wait a minute, you can't do this, you can't do that. Even an example I like to give is imagine a couple of boys in what might look like the wildest kind of play. They're a play fight. They're swinging sticks at one another. They're pushing one another around. They're wrestling. It looks really wild, but that activity is bound by rules. You don't really hit the other person with a stick. You don't kick, you don't bite, you don't scratch. If you push the other person down, you push them down on something soft, not on the hard concrete. Those rules don't even have to be stated because it's understood by both of those boys. They would be stated if one of them either accidentally or on purpose violated it. Hey, that hurt. I'm out of here if you do that again. Every act of play is an act of self-control. And children are learning to control themselves in play. The great Russian psychologist Vygotsky argued, he believed that was the biggest lesson of play. I say it's the social learning, but I also agree with Vygotsky. This is a huge lesson. Learning how to control your impulses, learning how to abide by the socially agreed upon rules or the self-determined rules if you're playing by yourself, but most especially the socially determined rules. We are playing this game. And within the context of this game, these are the rules. You can discuss the rules. The rules can be democratically made, but you have to follow the rules. And so children learn that. And there's actually research, old Russian research actually, showing that children are better at following rules in play than they are in real life. The same kids who don't seem to be able to follow the rules in the classroom can follow the rules in play.
Because they have more control and they have the right to quit. And like what Kaity said in the classroom, you don't have a right to quit. You can't just walk. Like you had said at the very beginning, your son had mentioned how they have an open door policy, but you're not allowed to leave. And whereas in play, you can. And I've never, ever thought of play that way. So thank you for just enlightening us on how there's just a lot more to it.
The final characteristic of play is that it always is creative. There are these rules, but they never determine exactly what you're supposed to do. At every move, it's your choice. Whether you're playing chess or whether you're in that rough and tumble game or no matter sandcastle, it's always creative at every step of the way. So play is always creative. It's how children exercise their creativity. It's how they become good at creativity. And especially for young children, it's also highly imaginative. So young children play these amazing fantasy games. It's pretending that we're superheroes, pretending there's a troll under the bridge, and what are we going to do about the troll under the bridge? They're engaged in what logicians would call the highest level of human thinking when they're doing this, hypothetical thinking. What if this were true? Then what else has to be true? What if there's a troll under the bridge? Well, we better not go under the bridge, or we better give the troll a cookie so it doesn't eat us. This is hypothetical deductive reasoning. There are some psychologists like Jean Piaget who used to argue that children under the age of 11 are not capable of that. But if you watch children play, they're doing it all the time. They're constantly engaged in hypothetical deductive reasoning. It turns out they can do it in play. When you ask it as a philosophical question, they don't get that this is actually play. We're just pretending here. And so they don't get it right. By age 11, they understand this is just kind of a trick that the person questioning me is drawing me into, and they understand the trick. And so they answer the question correctly. So there are still people who believe that children under the age of 11 are not capable of hypothetical deductive reasoning. And it's simply not true. They're perfectly capable of it. They just don't understand that anybody would engage in that kind of reasoning unless they're playing. So then they engage in that kind of reasoning all the time in play, and they're exercising their ability for that kind of reasoning in play.
That's amazing. So what I'm hearing, like if you ask any parent, like what kind of human do you want your kids to grow up into? They're going to say something like, I want them to be successful in the world. I want them to love learning. I want them to be happy. I want them to be kind, able to get along with others. All of these things. I want them to be proactive. I want them to take control of their life. I want them to take responsibility for things. All of these things that we say we want so desperately for our kids, the definition of success, all of these things are rooted in play. And yet play is the thing that feels risky for us. Like, oh, I need to make sure they're in their seat, doing their math, in order to keep them on this path of success, when what I hear you saying is that it's kind of quite the opposite.
It is quite the opposite. And unfortunately, what happens is it doesn't occur for all children, but many children, the natural inborn desire to take charge of your own life, to explore on your own, to seek what you like to do, gets drilled out and you become passive. I think one of the worsts of what's happened to our society is parents believe that they have to constantly amuse their child, that it's the parent's job to be sure that the child has something to do. And that never was true in the past. That's not true across cultures. This is a modern sense that parents are supposed to be sure that their child has something to do. Otherwise, the child will get bored. The child will just waste time. One of the best things that happened during COVID is parents began to realize I can't amuse my child all the time. And they learned that, wait a minute, my child is actually doing some interesting things on their own. We did a study through the Let Grow Foundation I'm part of. We did a very large scale study of how families adapted during COVID, and we were looking at families where the child was between 8 and 13 years old, and family after family would tell us, the parents would tell us, "I'm amazed, my child, you know, without all these other things that my child had in the schedule, not going to school, but not going to Chinese calligraphy classes and music lessons and judo, whatever else the child was taking, the running around doing it. My child suddenly had time, and my child was getting bored, but my child overcame the boredom, figured out things he wanted to do. Believe it or not, my child said, I would like to make dinner. What parent wouldn't want their child to make dinner? But interesting, it turns out a lot of kids would like to do that, but they've never been allowed to do it. Maybe because the parent thinks it's dangerous, or the kid would just make a mess and they would do a bad job. But parents were discovering that, or they found suddenly bicycle riding became a big thing. It's something you could do and socially isolated. You could go outdoors. You weren't spreading the COVID by doing it or catching it. Bicycle sales, bicycles went out of stock in the state I live in. No, you couldn't buy a bicycle. Everybody was looking for used bicycles. And I am a big bicyclist, and for the first time, I would see kids out riding bicycles that I'd never seen before. So look what happens. You give kids some time, take away all that busyness, and they begin to do things on their own. There were kids who said, yeah, I missed seeing my friends at school. I did miss seeing my friends at school. And many of them said, I'm looking forward to school opening again because I want to see my friends. Interesting. We asked the question, are you looking forward to school, and why? Most of them said they are looking forward to getting back to school. And essentially everyone, in terms of why, it was to see my friends. None of them said it was because I'm missing algebra. None of them said that. A few of them said I miss such a teacher that I really like. Few of them said I miss going to the library. I like the library. A few of them said I miss gym class, but some of them said I was really happy to be missing gym class. But what they also said is, during this period of time, I wasn't so isolated. I was playing video games with my friends online. I was learning how to use Zoom. I learned a lot about how to use the computer to communicate. Even young kids were doing this, and they were taking initiative in doing this because they wanted to communicate with their friends in the only way that they could during that time. So I think one lesson that comes from this is that if we want kids to learn how to take initiative, to learn how to do things on their own, and if we want them to be able, we have to give them time to do it. And that's one of the things we're not doing. We're not giving them time. We're filling their time all the time because we almost think it's our job to do that.
Yeah, we're too afraid of that phrase of "I'm bored." I'm sure that's such a trigger for so many parents, but my kids are bored all the time, and they know not even to come to me and say that, because instead they just go and grab a book. Or you said cook dinner last night. I had potatoes sitting on the counter, and I had to run out for something. I come back and they were all chopped and peeled. I didn't, my 11-year-old just saw the potatoes because he was bored. So that's just the culture that we have in our house. And it's amazing how much my kids have learned.
Kids, especially young kids, want to do things that are helpful. There's actually a lot of research showing this. Toddlers want to help, but in our culture, we don't allow them to help because we think it'll slow us down, and it will slow us down. They're not going to their toddlers are not going to do a good job of sweeping the floor or washing the dishes and so on. But what people in other cultures know, and some of these studies have been done among Mexican Americans. What they know, and based on these studies, is that if you allow the toddler to help, the toddler right from the beginning develops a feeling of feeling good about helping, feeling like a partnership, like I'm not
Mm-hmm.
being served here. I'm part of the team here. I'm part of the team that's involved in making this household work. And they grow up with that sense, and they continue on through. Once they become, by the time they're 5 or 6, they're good at helping. They really can cook. They really can clean the house. They really can wash the clothes. They really can take care of their younger siblings.
Yeah, and they're intrinsically motivated to do so, because Micheline Duklev talks about this in Hunt, Gather, Parent. Are you familiar with her?
Yes.
She goes into these indigenous, communities, and she said, and the parent doesn't even have to tell the child to help out because they have been helping since they were a toddler. And even though it takes a lot more time, the adults are so patient and just allow the toddler to do it however they want. They don't correct. They don't, try to do it for them. And it's really amazing how you said 5, 6, 7 years old, they're fully independent and able to help, and they want to.
And again, in our culture, this is relatively new. So back when I was a kid, and I was a kid in the 1950s, a long time ago, uh, the idea that you would have chores was absolutely just not even everybody had chores at home from as early as you could do it.
Yeah, without charts, without chore charts.
Yeah, and without bribing, it was just understood. This is part of being part of the family, is carrying out this helping out at home. But I talk about play, and some people would think this is the opposite of play, but it's not really the opposite of play, because it's something that's self-directed. You're not there managing the chore. Another mistake we make is that if we ask our kids to help, we want to tell them exactly how to do it. That ruins it for them. Nobody likes to be micromanaged. Kids don't like it. Husbands don't like it. Wives don't like it. I don't like it if my wife, fortunately, my wife doesn't really do this, but this is pretend now, right? But I wouldn't like it if my wife not only wanted me to clean the house, but told me exactly how to clean the house. If she wants me to clean the house, she's got to lower her standards a little bit. And if you want your kid to cook dinner or to wash the dishes, you got to lower your standards a little bit. You can't have it both ways. You can't have somebody helping you but want them to do it exactly how you would do it. You have to give them a certain amount of autonomy, a certain amount of trust. You have to compromise with their standards if you want that. And so many people today don't do that. So many people want to manage the house, and exactly they want to manage the house. And that also inhibits kids from actually being able to help and feel good about helping.
Right. Kids are really looking for autonomy, right? And this is a great way to introduce them to that. And they're also looking for competence, which is this chores and helping is one of the number one ways that they can develop that competence. If we don't let them be bad, they're never going to be good at it, right? There's a developmental path there that we're cutting them off from, essentially, when we're saying, if you can't do it my way, or if you can't do it well, then you're not going to do it at all. And that really is, they develop kind of a distaste for helping then, because helping is a thing that makes them feel incompetent, or that it robs them of their autonomy if you micromanage. So that becomes something that they're going to push against on. And when you say it's chore time, you're going to get a lot of resistance. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot there in the toddler
I think
age,
that's
when they're
right.
like, I want to help. We got to ride that train.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And everything that you're saying about chores totally ties in with what you have researched about play. So I love how this all ties in together. And we could keep talking, but we are running out of time. And so this is a question, and I love your answer to this question because you had emailed me about this. But who is someone who has kindled your love of learning, curiosity, motivation, and passion?
Yeah, so you did send me that question, and I tried to think of I actually spent a little bit of time trying to think of it, and I couldn't think of anybody. I could think of a lot of people that have been useful, but and my real answer is this, that nobody has to condole it. This is natural. This is You can quash it, but you can't create it. You can quash it, but not create it. That There's actually a T-shirt that quotes me on this by a play museum that they created this T-shirt. They have a sign up with my name under it, and what the little saying is you can't teach creativity. You can only let it bloom, and it blooms in play. And I think that this is the same thing about passion, about interests, about curiosity. People talk about, oh, I need to nurture curiosity. You don't need to nurture curiosity. Children are born curious. You can't stop them from being curious unless you lock them in a closet. But we do the equivalent of locking them in a closet when we send them to school. Because when we send them to typical schools, their curiosity is quashed, no matter how wonderful the teacher is. In that situation, you can't have 30 kids in a class or even 20 kids in a class and let all of them be following their own interests, unless it's a school like Sudbury Valley, where my child. You can't have order in the classroom. You can't have standardized testing and everybody's going to take the same test, because everybody's curiosity takes them in different directions. So when children are curious in school, it's a disruption. My child was a very curious child, and he refused to give up his curiosity. He he refused to do things that didn't make sense to him or were not interesting to him, or he could already do so well. Why do it again? But if he had a different personality, less resistant, it's very possible that his curiosity, his exploration, could have been his drive to explore, his drive to figure out things himself, could have been quashed. He could have, and I think that's what we are very often doing in school. I think this is one of the reasons. So I've heard from people who are hiring new college graduates. So this continues even through college, where you're being told what to do, and you don't then not less and less initiative for students in college. So I hear from employers of young college graduates that I've hired this person to figure out problems and to solve problems, but he wants to come to me to tell him exactly what to do. But I hired him to figure out what to do. So we're raising people who don't think it's their job to figure out what to do. They think that there must be somebody else who's figuring it out, and that person is supposed to tell them what to do. I think even in the realm of emotionality, we've become, it used to be somebody was, somebody was bullied, say, or somebody felt bad, they were called a bad name or something, and for the most part, you didn't never told your parents this. You just tried to figure it out. You didn't want your parents to even know this. You were kind of embarrassed that this happened. But if you told your parents, what your parents would usually say is something like, "Well, so what are you going to do about that? How might you deal with this bully? Maybe just don't play with him anymore." Maybe they might give some suggestions like that. But now, maybe you need to see a counselor. Maybe you need to see a psychologist. It's like we're almost teaching kids that they're helpless, that they have to go to some authority figure to solve their problems for them. They're incapable of solving their problems. We're seeing this on college campuses. So mental health centers are overwhelmed with people, with young students coming to them with problems that in the past they would have solved on their own. They were called a bad name and they're being fallen apart about it. Well, if you've been out there playing with other kids away from adults, you've been called bad names lots of times and you've gotten used to it. And maybe sometimes it's in humor, maybe bad humor, maybe sometimes it's just somebody mad. Maybe it's real meanness and hate, in which case you know what to do, avoid them, or that. But now it's like it's a reason to become. It's called trauma. It's a reason that you need counseling. It's a reason that you. So, I think that this idea that we are feeding in increasingly to the idea that children are incompetent and they need adults to solve their problems. So where we used to have the idea, children are tough, they can roll with the punches, they don't fall apart, and we need to reinforce that aspect of them.
I love that. Well, we are going to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time. How can people learn more about your work or find your writing?
So there's various ways. I have a personal website. It's just petergray.org. You can just Google Peter Gray website or petergray.org. And on the website, you can find PDFs of many of my published articles for people who are interested in them. And I write in pretty plain English, so you don't have to have a PhD in psychology to read the articles. So there are articles about these topics, articles about play, articles about the effects of play deprivation. You can also find some of the YouTubes of some of my talks there. So that's one route. I have long been writing a blog for Psychology Today magazine, and there are about 230 essays that I've written on topics like what we're talking about here, and that's easy to find. Just Google Peter Gray Psychology Today. I have recently, just a few months ago, started a Substack. A lot of people were telling me everybody's doing Substacks these days, and you should write a Substack. So I've started a Substack called Play Makes Us Human. And this is about play, not just children's play. It's about adults' play. It's about the role of play in human evolution, the role of play in human cultural evolution, and as well as the role of play in children's development. I argue that, every one of us has these three histories: our biological history, our cultural history, and our developmental history. And play was important to all of those histories. It helped shape who we are. It helped shape the difference between a human being and the other apes biologically. It helped shape the differences among cultures, that some cultures are far more playful, different cultures have different interpretations of play. Many of the inventions of culture came about from play. Play is really the mother of invention, not necessity. And so that's what this Substack is about.
I love that. Awesome.
That's amazing.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the KindlED podcast. We've really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Been very happy to do so.
That's it for today. We hope you really enjoyed this episode on play. And if you want to dive deeper, you can go back to episode 8, where Kaity and I talk about play in a different way as well. And so if this episode was helpful to you, please like, subscribe, and follow us on social media at Prenda Learn. If you have a question, all you need to do is leave a comment or email us at podcast@prenda.com. You can also join our Facebook group, which is called the KindlED Collective, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Sunday Spark.
The KindlED podcast is brought to you by Prenda. Prenda makes it easy for you to start and run an amazing microschool based on all the things we talk about here on the KindlED podcast. If you want more information about guiding a Prenda microschool, go to prenda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep kindling.